In addition to English, literature has been written in a wide variety of other languages in Britain, that is, the United Kingdom, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. This includes literature in Gaelic, Welsh, Latin, Cornish, Guernésiais, Jèrriais, Manx, and Irish. Literature in Anglo-Saxon is treated as English literature and literature in Scots as Scottish literature. British identity. The nature of British identity has changed over time. The island that contains England, Scotland, and Wales has been known as Britain from the time of the Roman Pliny the Elder, though the original inhabitants spoke mainly various Celtic languages, and English as the national language had its beginnings with the Anglo-Saxon invasion of c. 450 AD. The various constituent parts of the present United Kingdom joined at different times. Wales was annexed by the Kingdom of England under the Acts of Union of 1536 and 1542, and it was not until 1707 with a treaty between England and Scotland that the Kingdom of England became the Kingdom of Great Britain. This merged in 1801 with the Kingdom of Ireland to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Until fairly recent times, the original Celtic languages continued to be spoken in Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland, and still survive, especially in parts of Wales. Subsequently, the impact of Irish nationalism led to the partition of the island of Ireland in 1921, which means that literature of the Republic of Ireland is not British, although literature from Northern Ireland is both Irish and British. More recently, the relationship between England and Wales and Scotland has changed through the establishment of parliaments in both those countries, in addition to the British Parliament in London. Early Britain, 450–100 AD. Latin literature, mostly ecclesiastical, continued to be written in the centuries following the withdrawal of the Roman Empire at the beginning of the 5th century, including chronicles by Bede, Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, and Gildas de Excidioe Conquestu Britanniae. Various Celtic languages were spoken by many of British people at this time, and among the most important written works that have survived are Gododin and the Mabinogion. Gododin is a medieval Welsh poem consisting of a series of elegies to the men of the Britannic Kingdom of Gododin and its allies who, according to the conventional interpretation, died fighting the Angles of Deira and Bernicia at a place named Catraeth in c. AD 600. It is traditionally ascribed to the bard Aneirin, and survives only in one manuscript, known as the Book of Aneirin. The name Mabinogion is a convenient label for a collection of 11 prose stories collated from 2 medieval Welsh manuscripts known as the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hengist. They are written in Middle Welsh, the common literary language between the end of the 11th century and the 14th century. They include the 4 tales that form Pedair Ainchwy Mabinogi. The tales draw on pre-Christian Celtic mythology, international folk tale motifs, and early medieval historical traditions. For the 8th to the 15th centuries, Vikings and Norse settlers and their descendants colonized parts of what is now modern Scotland. Some Old Norse poetry survives relating to this period, including the Orkneyinga saga, an historical narrative of the history of the Orkney Islands, for the capture by the Norwegian king in the 9th century onwards until about 1200. Late medieval period, 1100 to 1500. Following the Norman conquest in 1066, the Norman language became the language of England's nobility. During the whole of the 12th century, the Anglo-Norman language shared with Latin the distinction of being the literary language of England, and it was in use at the court until the 14th century. It was not until the reign of Henry VII that English became the native tongue of the kings of England. Works were still written in Latin Latin and include Gerald of Wales's late 12th century book on his beloved Wales, Itinerarium Cambriae, and following the Norman conquest of 1066, Anglo-Norman literature developed in the Anglo-Norman realm, introducing literary trends from continental Europe, such as the chanson d'Augusta. However, the indigenous development of Anglo-Norman literature was precocious in comparison to continental oral literature. Geoffrey of Monmouth was one of the major figures in the development of British history and the popularity for the tales of King Arthur. He is best known for his chronicle Historia Regum Britanniae of 1136, which spread Celtic motifs to a wider audience. Wace, who wrote in Norman French, is the earliest known poet from Jersey, also developed the Arthurian legend. At the end of the 12th century, Lemoyne Brute adapted Wace to make the first English-language work to use the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Early English Jewish literature developed after the Norman conquest with Jewish settlement in England. Marichi Harnakedam is known chiefly as the author of a 13th-century set of over 100 fables, called Mishla Shulim. The development of Jewish literature in medieval England ended with the Edict of Expulsion of 1290. The multilingual nature of the audience for literature in the 14th century can be illustrated by the example of John Gower, a contemporary of William Langland and a personal friend of Geoffrey Chaucer. Gower is remembered primarily for three major works: the Miroir de l'Homme, Vox Clamantis, and Confessio Amantis, three long poems written in Anglo-Norman, Latin and Middle English respectively, which are united by common moral and political themes. Dafydd ap Gwilym is regarded as one of the leading Welsh poets and amongst the great poets of Europe in the Middle Ages. His main themes are love and nature. The influence of the ideas of courtly love found in the troubadour poetry of Provençal was a significant influence on his poetry. Major Scottish writers from the 15th century include Henry Zune, Dunbar, Douglas and Lindsay, wrote in Middle Scots, often simply called English, the dominant language of Scotland. In the Cornish language, Passion Agan Lloyd, a poem of 259 8-line verses written in 1375, is one of the earliest surviving works of Cornish literature. The most important work of literature surviving from the Middle Cornish period is an Ordinary Cernywek, a 9,000-line religious drama composed around the year 1400. Three plays in Cornish known as the Ordinalia have survived from this period: the Renaissance 1500 to 1660. The spread of printing affected the transmission of literature across Britain and Ireland. The first book printed in English, William Caxton's own translation of Recueil of the Histories of Troy, was printed abroad in 1473, to be followed by the establishment of the first printing press in England in 1474. The establishment of a printing press in Scotland under royal patent from James IV in 1507 made it easier to disseminate Scottish literature. The first printing press in Ireland followed later in 1551. Although the first book in Welsh to be printed was produced by John Pryse in 1546, restrictions on printing meant that only clandestine presses, such as that of Robert Gwynn, who published Wydreg Christian Ogul in 1586-1587, could operate in Wales until 1695. The first legal printing press to be set up in Wales was in 1718 by Isaac Carter. The first printed work in Manx dates from 1707, a translation of a prayer book catechism in English by Bishop Thomas Wilson. Printing arrived even later in other parts of Britain and Ireland. The first printing press in Jersey was set up by Matthew Alexandra in 1784. The earliest datable text in Manx, a poetic history of the Isle of Man from the introduction of Christianity, dates to the 16th century at the latest. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England and of King James I saw the development of Britishness in literature. In anticipation of James VI's expected inheritance of the English throne, court masques in England were already developing the new literary imagery of a united Great Britain, sometimes delving into Roman and Celtic sources. William Camden's Britannia, a county-by-county description of Great Britain and Ireland, was an influential work of chorography, a study relating landscape, geography, antiquarianism, and history. Britannia came to be viewed as the personification of Britain, in imagery that developed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The Renaissance in Wales was marked by humanism and scholarship. The Welsh language, its grammar and lexicography, was studied for the first time and biblical studies flourished. Welsh writers such as John Owen and William Vaughan wrote in Latin or English to communicate their ideas outside Wales, but the humanists were unsuccessful in opening the established practices of professional Welsh poets to Renaissance influences. For the Reformation until the 19th century, most literature in the Welsh language was religious in character. Morgan Llwyd's Llyfrwyd Triad took the form of a dialogue between an eagle, a dove, and a raven. The Reformation and vernacular literature. At the Reformation, the translation of liturgy and Bible into vernacular languages provided new literary models. The Book of Common Prayer and the Authorized King James Version of the Bible have been hugely influential. The King James Bible, one of the biggest translation projects in the history of English up to this time, was started in 1604 and completed in 1611. The earliest surviving examples of Cornish prose are pre-Goth Outreger, a set of 66 sermons translated from English by John Tregear 1555 to 1557. In 1567, William Salisbury's Welsh translations of the New Testament and Book of Common Prayer were published. William Morgan's translation of the whole Bible followed in 1588 and remained the standard Welsh Bible until well into the 20th century. The first Irish translation of the New Testament was begun by Nicholas Walsh, Bishop of Ossory, continued by John Kearney, his assistant, and Dr. Nehemiah Donnellan, Archbishop of Tuam, and finally completed by William O'Domnall. The work was printed in 1602. The work of translating the Old Testament was undertaken by William Bedell, Bishop of Kilmore, who completed his translation within the reign of Charles I. However, it was not published until 1685 in a revised version by Narcissus Marsh, Archbishop of Dublin. The Book of Common Order was translated into Scottish Gaelic by Sion Carsiul, Bishop of the Isles, and printed in 1567. This is considered the first printed book in Scottish Gaelic, though the language resembles Classical Irish. The Irish translation of the Bible dating from the Elizabethan period was in use in Scotland until the Bible was translated into Scottish Gaelic. James Kirkwood promoted Gaelic education and attempted to provide a version of William Bedell's Bible translations into Irish, edited by his friend Robert Kirk, which failed, though he did succeed in publishing a Psalter in Gaelic. The Book of Common Prayer was translated into French by Jerseyman Jean Girel, later Dean of Windsor, and published for use in the Channel Islands in 1663 as Anglicanism was established as the state religion after the Stuart Restoration. The Book of Common Prayer and Bible were translated into Manx in the 17th and 18th centuries. The printing of prayers for the poor families was projected by Thomas Wilson in a Memorandum of Whit Sunday 1699, but was not carried out until the 30th of May 1707, the date of issue of his Principles and Duties of Christianity, in English and Manx, with short and plain directions and prayers, 1707. This was the first book published in Manx, and is often styled the Manx Catechism. The Gospel of St. Matthew was translated, with the help of his Vicars General in 1722 and published in 1748 under the sponsorship of his successor as bishop, Mark Hildersley. The remaining Gospels and the Acts were also translated into Manx under his supervision, but not published. Hildersley printed the New Testament and the Book of Common Prayer, translated under his direction by the clergy of the diocese, and the Old Testament was finished and transcribed in December 1772, at the time of the bishop's death. The Manx Bible established a standard for written Manx. A tradition of Manx carvels, religious songs or carols, developed. Religious literature was common, but secular writing much rarer. Translations of parts of the Bible into Cornish have existed since the 17th century. The early works involved the translation of individual passages, chapters or books of the Bible. Latin literature. Latin continued in use as a language of learning, long after the Reformation had established the vernacular as the liturgical language. In Scotland, Latin as a literary language thrived into the 17th century as Scottish writers writing in Latin were able to engage with their audiences on an equal basis in a prestige language without feeling hampered by the less confident handling of English. Utopia is a work of fiction and political philosophy by Thomas More, published in 1516. The book, written in Latin, is a framed narrative primarily depicting a fictional island society and its religious, social and political customs. New Atlantis is a utopian novel by Sir Francis Bacon, published in Latin in 1624 and in English in 1627. In this work, Bacon portrayed a vision of the future of human discovery and knowledge, expressing his aspirations and ideals for humankind. The novel depicts the creation of a utopian land where generosity and enlightenment, dignity and splendor, piety and public spirit are the commonly held qualities of the inhabitants of the mythical Bensalem. The plan and organization of his ideal college, Salomon's House, envisioned the modern research university in both applied and pure sciences. Scotsman George Buchanan was the Renaissance writer from Britain who had the greatest international reputation, being considered the finest Latin poet since classical times. As he wrote mostly in Latin, his works traveled across Europe as did he himself. His Latin paraphrases of the Hebrew Psalms remained in print for centuries and were used into the 19th century for the purposes of studying Latin. Amongst English poets who wrote poems in Latin in the 17th century were George Herbert and John Milton. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes' Elementa Philosophica de Civ was in Latin. However, things were changing, and by about 1700 the growing movement for the use of national languages had reached academia, and an example of the transition is Isaac Newton's writing career, which began in New Latin and ended in English. Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica in Latin, Optics, 1704, in English. The Restoration, 1660 to 1700. Ian Lom was a royalist Scottish Gaelic poet appointed Poet Laureate in Scotland by Charles II at the Restoration. He delivered a eulogy for the coronation, and remained loyal to the Stuarts after 1688, opposing the Williamites and later, in his vituperative Orin and Aga Ianaid, the 1707 union of the Parliaments. Sin le Uimhe Allen is an account of the Irish Confederate Wars which reflected the Ulster Catholic point of view, written by Tarlac O'Mealan. Nicholas Boson wrote 3 significant texts in Cornish, Nebaz Jèrriais Udia Othocar Noig between 1675 and 1708, Jow and Cian Horth Py, and Trifointa Science, published by Edward Lhuyd in 1707, though written earlier, and the Duchess of Cornwall's Progress, partly in English, now known only in fragments. The first two are the only known surviving Cornish prose texts from the 17th century. In Scotland, after the 17th century, Anglicisation increased, though Lowland Scots was still spoken by the vast majority of the population, and Scottish Gaelic by a minority. At the time, many of the oral ballads from the borders and the northeast were written down. The 17th century probably also saw the composition in Orkney of the only original literary work in the Norn language, a ballad called Hildina. Writers of the period include Robert Semple, Lady Wardlaw and Lady Grizzel Bailey. 18th century. The union of the Parliaments of Scotland and England in 1707 to form a single kingdom of Great Britain and the creation of a joint state by the Acts of Union had little impact on the literature of England nor on national consciousness among English writers. The situation in Scotland was different. The desire to maintain a cultural identity while partaking of the advantages offered by the English literary market and English literary standard language led to what has been described as the invention of British literature by Scottish writers. English writers, if they considered Britain at all, tended to assume it was merely England writ large. Scottish writers were more clearly aware of the new state as a cultural amalgam comprising more than just England. Ellis Wynn's Gaelic with Y Bath CWSC, first published in London in 1703, is regarded as a Welsh language classic. It is generally said that no better model exists of such pure, idiomatic Welsh, before writers had become influenced by English style and method. A mover in the classical revival of Welsh literature in the 18th century was Lewis Morris, one of the founders in 1751 of the Honourable Society of Cymrodorion, a Welsh literary society in London, at the time the most important centre of Welsh publishing. He set out to counter the trend among patrons of Welsh literature to turn towards English culture. He attempted to recreate a classic school of Welsh poetry with his support for Goronwy and other Augustans. Goronwy's plans for a Miltonic epic were never achieved but influenced the aims of Eisteddfodau competitions through the 19th century. The Scottish Gaelic Enlightenment figure Alasdair MacWhystere Alasdair compiled the first secular book in Scottish Gaelic to be printed, Liber Theogascain Minan, a Gaelic-English glossary. The second secular book in Scottish Gaelic to be published was his poetry collection Ais Erin ar Sean Shannon Albanarich. Alasdair MacWhystere Alasdair was the most overtly nationalist poet in Gaelic of the 18th century. He was influenced by James Thomson's The Seasons as well as by Gaelic village poets, such as Ian MacFhatcher. As part of the oral literature of the Highlands, few of the works of such village poets were published at the time, although some have been collected since. Scottish Gaelic poets produced laments on the Jacobite defeats of 1715 and 1745. Margaret Nye and Lachlan and Katrina Nick Ferghise are among woman poets who reflected on the crushing effects on traditional Gaelic culture of the aftermath of the Jacobite uprisings. A consequent sense of desolation pervaded the works of Scottish Gaelic writers such as Duffield Buchanan, which mirrored many of the themes of the graveyard poets writing in England. A legacy of Jacobite verse was later compiled by James Hogg in his Jacobite Relics. In the Scots-speaking areas of Ulster there was traditionally a considerable demand for the work of Scottish poets, often in locally printed editions. These included Alexander Montgomery's The Sherry and the Sleigh in 1700, over a decade later an edition of poems by Sir David Lindsay, and 9 printings of Alan Ramsay's The Gentle Shepherd between 1743 and 1793. 19th century. The Welsh novel in English starts with The Adventures and Vagaries of T.W.M. Sion Cati by T.J.R. Pritchard, and novelists following him developed two important genres, the industrial novel and the rural romance. Serial fiction in Welsh had been appearing from 1822 onwards, but the work to be recognisable as the first novel in Welsh was William Ellis Jones' 1830 Y Bardd Noi Y Medway Cymraeg. This was a moralistic work, as were many of the productions of the time. The first major novelist in the Welsh language was Daniel Owen, author of works such as Rhys Lewis and Enoch Hughes. The first novel in Scottish Gaelic was John McCormack's Dun Alwyn known Tioire na Diobarach, which was serialized in the People's Journal in 1910, before publication in book form in 1912. The publication of a second Scottish Gaelic novel, Antioga More by Angus Robertson, followed within a year. Philippe Lesueur-Morant's Jèrriais Tales of Bram Below and Innocent Abroad in Paris were an immediate success in Jersey in 1889 and went through a number of reprintings. Ewan MacLachlan was a Scots poet of this period who translated the first 8 books of Homer's Iliad into Scottish Gaelic. He also composed and published his own Gaelic attempts in verse and metrical effusions, and contributed greatly to the 1828 Gaelic English Dictionary. Dennis Corbett published collections of Guernésiais poems Les Feuilles de la Forêt and Les Chants du Drain Raimu, and also brought out an annual poetry anthology 1874 to 1877, similar to Augustus Asplatler-Grove's annual in Jersey 1868 to 1875. Increased literacy in rural and outlying areas and wider access to publishing, through, for example, local newspapers encouraged regional literary development as the 19th century progressed. Some writers in lesser-used languages and dialects of the islands gained a literary following outside the native regions. For example, William Barnes in Dorset, George Metavere in Guernsey and Robert Pippin Marrett in Jersey. George Metavere published Rhymes Guernésiais, a collection of poems in Guernésiais and French in 1831, and Fantasies Guernésiaises in 1866. Metivere's poems had first appeared in newspapers from 1813 onward, but he spent time in Scotland in his youth where he became familiar with the Scots literary tradition, although he was also influenced by Occitan literature. The first printed anthology of Jèrriais poetry, Rhymes Jèrriais, was published in 1865. The so-called Crank and Rhyme, produced by John Davy of Boswednac, one of the last people with some traditional knowledge of the language, may be the last piece of traditional Cornish literature. John Ceiriog Hughes desired to restore simplicity of diction and emotional sincerity, and offer Welsh poetry what Wordsworth and Coleridge did for English poetry. Edward Farraher has been considered the last important native writer of Manx. He wrote poetry, reminiscences of his life as a fisherman, and translations of selected Aesop's fables. The development of Irish literary culture was encouraged in the late 19th and early 20th century by the Irish Literary Revival, which was supported by William Butler Yeats, Augusta, Lady Gregory, and John Millington Synge. The revival stimulated a new appreciation of traditional Irish literature. This was a nationalist movement that also encouraged the creation of works written in the spirit of Irish, as distinct from British culture. While drama was an important component of this movement, it also included prose and poetry.